You're listening to the Bearded Theologians podcast, hosted by Zach Bechtold and Matt Franks. If you'd like to learn more about the Bearded Theologians, you can go online at beardedtheologians.com, where we have past podcasts, blogs, and a couple items for sale. So check us out, beardedtheologians.com. Thank you for listening, and enjoy this week's show.
I still have half of it left. You're listening to the Bearded Theologians podcast, hosted by Matt Franks
and Zach Bechtold.
So this week on the podcast, as we are continuing making our way through the book of Genesis, we've kind of recognized that we could spend 6 to 8 weeks on Father Abraham or Abram, depending on when you look at the story. And yes, Zach's already singing the song in his head because Father Abraham had many sons, and many sons had Father Abraham. I am one of them, and so are you.
Don't go too far. There's a copyright on that.
So Zach, let's talk about what we're going to talk about today.
That's at least 10%. Yeah. So we're going to talk about. There's a fullness to Abram, to Abraham, to the story that again continues to answer the question of who we are, where we come from, and we're gonna peek into the classic story of Abraham and Isaac, and knowing that it's a pretty rich story in and of itself, and lends to a whole lot of what the rest of the Hebrew Bible points back to and talks about, especially with the Old Testament fathers, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and those guys. And so we're gonna read a little bit out of Genesis 22 and do the thing that we do with it. So here, from chapter 22. After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham," and he said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you." So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place from far away. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey, and the boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. Sorry, got lost. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried. I can't read. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father, "Abraham, father." And he said, "Here I am, son, my son." He said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." So the 2 of them walked on together. When they came to the place that Abraham showed them, Abraham built an altar, and they laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand, took the knife to kill him. But the angel of the Lord called from the heavens and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. And so, despite my terrible reading there, this is a big story. And so, Matt, what kind of jumps out to you in the first little bit of that story of Abraham and Isaac?
Don't preach this for Father's Day, whatever you think you may do. However, if that's something your church does, I actually, I have to be honest with you, I don't do Father's Day and Mother's Day in the church. I don't preach those Sundays. I don't, they're not liturgical Sundays, and I'm very liturgical in some aspects of being liturgical. This is not one that I would preach. What's really funny, this is one of the first texts. I think this was the first Hebrew Bible text I ever preached. I remember preaching it, and I remember the pastor that I was working for at the time, like the amount of research that he gave me was so thick, because there's so much to this scripture that it's vital important to the story. One, I think it shows Abraham's willingness to submit to God in a lot of different ways, and how that works, and his understanding, the shared understanding of covenant, and when asked in a covenant to live out a particular relationship, you will do whatever that means, and whatever the cost may mean for you. And you what would really be fun if you're sitting with a group is sitting with a group and looking at the covenants that are made between Abram, and God. You'll see how the call to being faithful is very important, and what that looks like. And there are times where covenant is lived out very well, and there's times where it's not. Obviously, in the story that Zach read for you today, there's some very strong faithfulness in this, that he was willing. Like, I always imagine this scene. Like, I don't know if you've ever been, like, I don't know about you, Zach, but I know with me, like, when I'd go with my dad places, like, he would do that, like, hey, carry this, and you'd be like, where are we going, what are we doing? And so, like, I imagine that's kind of how it was between the two, like, hey, what are we doing, where are we going? And I don't know, just do what you're told. Get in the car.
Right.
So,
right.
like,
I definitely, I have that conversation with my kids all the time. Get in the car, we're going somewhere. Where are we going? And my answer is always tallest mountain. Just because. Just get in the car. We're going to go somewhere. We're having an adventure today. And that very much feels like this moment of, hey Dad, where are we going? I get that we have like wood and we're going to go worship, and typically that means there's an offering. Where's the offering? And you can see Isaac really quickly starting to put the pieces together of this seems off.
I would almost say that, like, you could tell that he's thinking in his head that this isn't going to end well for me, is it?
Yeah. It's almost like that switch flips and he goes, oh, it's me. How do we do anything but this? Can I find something, a pigeon, a ground squirrel? Is there something else here?
So I'm looking at verse 6, and the way I'm reading this and imagining this is kind of reverse how I've always thought about it today.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I may read it differently another day, but the way I imagine it, he's like, all right, Isaac, lay on the ground here. And then he starts piling sticks on him. Like just lay here and plow sticks on you. And at that moment, you would have to imagine that Isaac's like, okay,
I'm more than just carrying these.
Either that, or Abraham pushed Isaac down on his back and he's laying like a turtle and he's just adding a few more sticks just to, like, and I know I'm reading into this text, I know, but like, this is one of those texts that your mind can go wild on. And I think that that's okay. And that, like, the true story that we need to see here is that, like, that both were willing to be faithful. Isaac understood his role and what he needed to do.
Sure.
Even though it was crazy and absurd. And if that's something we were finding ourselves to do, please, like, that's where I would almost say we need to call some health professionals and child protective services, because it's not normal.
Right. Well, and the big thing that we find in this text that we most often draw out is mostly Abraham's faithfulness and fear for God. And we've talked a lot about what the fear of God means on this podcast, and just this respect and admiration for God, and less of scared, shaky boogeyman fear, right? But you're right, there's a lot of faithfulness in this from both Abraham and Isaac. And when I read through this story again, it's not fair or right to project this stuff into the New Testament, but you see some parallels in some of the conversations that Jesus has with God as he's headed to the cross, and some things like that of, hey, is this what we're going to do? Okay. You know, in some of the faithfulness things there and the conversations that are had. But I love, because I don't think we don't get that very often in any biblical text, but especially the Old Testament, of the son having this conversation with the authority figure, with Abraham. Isaac being able to question, hey, what's going on here? What are we doing? And I think that's significant to the faithfulness of this story, and the faithfulness of Abraham and Isaac both, to have this really honest conversation where Abraham could have said, sit down, shut up, we're doing the thing. and yet his response is, God will provide.
Well, and I think that's where it's funny, like you said, that when your kids ask where you're going, and I've actually heard you say this to your children.
Yes.
Where we're going to the tallest mountain, like this would play well into that, and that you're taking them to the tallest mountain. However, yes. Like in this will totally change the way you think about that from now on as you say that.
No, that's always how I thought about it. A little bit of Dora the Explorer, a little bit of Abraham, Isaac.
But you know, he names the place, and depending on your biblical translation, you know, the Lord is seen, the Lord's seen, you know, the Lord's mountain. I mean, Abraham names this place as a connection point, and a remembrance point for him, that God sees what we're doing, and they would use that to remember the moment and remember that time. And I'm sure that anytime they would pass that, hey, Dad, remember that time you thought it'd be fun to sacrifice me because God told you to, you know, and you know, I mean, you know how we would play that off. I mean, I think that kind of ideal comes off even today. Like there are places we look at where we remember those moments, good, bad, ugly, whatever. And I think there's, you know, this is not one I've ever seen in Sunday school material, because how would you explain that to a child?
I have seen a coloring sheet for this.
I mean, I'm sure there is one, because I mean, it's not as complicated as some of the ones that we've seen, and especially in Abraham and Abram's story, there is there would be some questionable coloring sheets on some things, and I think that the richness and fullness of his story plays well into this idea of Genesis, you know, creating new, you know, coming out of, you know, how we became who we are and where we are. And I think that, like you, as you make that bridge to understand where we are and what God calls us to, it is about remaining faithful, even if the call seems a little bit off. Because we see this time and time again, you know, when we jump into Moses and when we jump into some of those other stories, that it's not the traditional, like, this is, you know, they met these requirements, they did these things, they were approved. It's more of a, hey, I'm calling you to do this because I, you know, want to make sure you're fully in. And I think there's some truth to that in that, as we reflect upon the story.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what it is taking these old stories and just reading through them and asking ourselves the questions, you know, putting ourselves in these people's shoes. You know, how would we respond? How would we be very human in these moments? I know if I were in Abraham's shoes, I'd be like, yeah, I don't know. I don't know that I'd be so willing. But it's less about the act of sacrificing your son, and it's hearing and going where we're called, and knowing that God will provide in these faithful ways, even when we're unsure, even when we're not quite sure about that direction. You know, just taking that step out in faith. And I think that's,
and I think that that's a good, you know, a good place to land for us today. Is that, like, how would you, you know, like, when you're called, how do you step out on faith? When God calls you, how do you step on faith? And then, you know, I know we could wrestle with how do we know it's God's calling versus, you know, other things, but I think that, you know, how are you stepping out to where God is calling you today? And I think that's a good place to land today. Anything else, Zach?
No, I like it. Gather up your sons and some sticks. Let's go.
We want to encourage you to go to our website at beardedtheologians.com. We have some really great content and things up. You know, we've been doing this for almost 6 years now. And so there's a lot of good stuff, some good things to buy too. It's coming up. Pastor Appreciation Month is coming up. if you have a bearded pastor, get them a Bearded Theologians mug. It would go well on their desk or at their home, or like Zach and I's case in our cars. Those are always good gifts to give to pastors, both bearded and unbearded. You don't have to have a beard to have a Bearded Theologians mug. It's not a requirement. But with Pastor Appreciation Month, t-shirt, sticker, whatever, goes well. And so just check us out at beardedtheologians.com. And so for the Bearded Theologians, I'm Matt Franks.
I'm Zach Bechtold. Thanks for helping us out.
First, guys, I want you to subscribe and like this video and push that thumbs up.
Thank you for listening to the Bearded Theologians podcast. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share on all social media outlets. You can check out old episodes and more information at beardedtheologians.com. Thanks for checking us out.